In the bustling city of Chicago, Dr. Clara Morgan has built her career on skill, integrity, and compassion. As one of the hospital's most respected surgeons, she has faced countless challenges in the operating room, but nothing could prepare her for the tragedy that changes everything. When a high-risk heart surgery ends in the unexpected death of her patient, Clara finds herself at the center of a storm. The grieving family, consumed by loss, files a lawsuit accusing her of negligence, thrusting her career, reputation, and sense of purpose into jeopardy. As the courtroom battle unfolds, Clara must confront not only the legal challenges, but also the judgment of her peers, the weight of her own self-doubt, and the crushing question: did she do everything she could? Amidst the chaos, moments of unexpected kindness begin to emerge, small acts that breathe hope into her darkest days and challenge her to rediscover the compassion that first drew her to medicine. But just as the lawsuit reaches its boiling point, a surprising encounter with the family of the deceased patient forces Clara to face the truth about healing, forgiveness, and the human connections that define her work. What begins as a fight for survival becomes a journey of resilience and redemption that will change not only Clara's life, but the lives of everyone around her. The late afternoon light filtered through the blinds of Dr. Clara Morgan's office at Chicago Memorial Hospital, casting a golden glow on the walls lined with framed degrees and medical accolades. Despite the serene ambiance, Clara's mind was anything but calm. She sat at her desk, scanning the patient chart of Peter Graham, a man in his late 50s with a failing heart. The situation was grim. Peter had been admitted with a ruptured valve, and his prognosis was bleak. Surgery was the only option, but it came with significant risks. Clara had performed dozens of similar procedures, but this case was different. Peter's medical history complicated everything. Her phone buzzed, breaking her focus. It was her nurse, Meredith. "Dr. Morgan, the Grahams are ready for the pre-surgery consultation," Meredith said. Clara stood, smoothing the front of her crisp white coat. Her reflection in the office window showed a poised, professional woman. Her natural curls were tied back, her face calm and determined. She drew a deep breath, steadying herself for the conversation ahead. The conference room was quiet when Clara entered, save for the nervous rustling of papers. Peter sat in a wheelchair, his pale face lined with exhaustion. Beside him were his wife, Laura, and their teenage son, Ben. The tension in the room was palpable. "Mr. Graham, Mrs. Graham, Ben," Clara began, taking a seat across from them. "Thank you for meeting with me. I want to ensure we discuss everything clearly before proceeding." She outlined the surgery in detail, her voice steady yet compassionate. She did not shy away from the risks. "There is a chance the procedure may not succeed," she said gently. "We will do everything we can, but given the condition of your heart, the outcome is uncertain." Laura clutched Peter's hand tightly, her eyes brimming with tears. "But there's a chance he could make it, right?" "There is," Clara said firmly, meeting her gaze. "But I want to ensure you are fully aware of the potential complications." The family exchanged uneasy glances, and Peter finally spoke, his voice hoarse. "Doctor, I trust you. Let's do it." That night, Clara lay awake in her small apartment on the south side, staring at the ceiling. Her home was modest but comfortable, a reflection of her practical nature. A framed photo of her parents sat on the bedside table, a reminder of the sacrifices they had made to support her dream of becoming a doctor. Despite her years of experience, Clara felt the familiar weight of responsibility pressing down on her chest. Surgery was never routine to her, it was a sacred trust, a chance to save a life. But she also knew that medicine was unpredictable, and outcomes were not always within her control. "Please," she whispered into the quiet night, "let him pull through." The operating room was a blur of motion and sterile precision. Clara's team moved seamlessly, their hands steady and their focus sharp. Hours passed as Clara worked, her mind calculating every move with exacting precision. But something went wrong. Peter's heart faltered, and despite their best efforts, they could not revive him. When Clara finally removed her gloves and stepped out of the operating room, her shoulders slumped with exhaustion and grief. She hated this part of the job, the moments when skill and effort were not enough. The family was waiting in the consultation room when Clara entered. The air was thick with tension. Laura rose to her feet, her expression a mixture of hope and dread. "I'm so sorry," Clara began, her voice heavy with regret. "We did everything we could, but Peter's heart couldn't sustain the procedure." Laura let out a sharp cry, collapsing into her chair. Ben stared at the floor, his hands clenched into fists. The devastation in their faces was a pain Clara knew all too well. She wanted to reach out, to comfort them, but she knew her words would feel hollow. "You said there was a chance," Laura shouted, her grief spilling over into anger. "You said you would do everything." "I did," Clara said softly, her own voice trembling. "I am so sorry for your loss." But her apology only seemed to deepen Laura's fury. "Sorry won't bring him back," she yelled, tears streaming down her face. "You killed him." Clara stood in silence, allowing Laura's anguish to fill the room. She understood it. Grief needed a target, and in that moment, Clara became it. 2 weeks later, Clara was in her office when a manila envelope was delivered to her desk. Inside were papers notifying her of a lawsuit filed by the Graham family, accusing her of negligence. Her hands trembled as she read the allegations. The words felt like a slap, each line questioning her competence and integrity. She thought of Peter, of the countless hours she had poured into his care, and felt a sharp pang of injustice. Clara leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. The lawsuit threatened not just her career, but the reputation she had spent years building. The weight of it pressed down on her. But beneath the fear, a spark of resolve ignited. "I will fight this," she whispered to herself. "I owe it to myself and to every patient I have ever treated." The sound of the gavel rang in Clara's ears long after the courtroom adjourned for the day. The lawsuit filed by Laura Graham was now officially underway. As Clara walked down the courthouse steps into the gray Chicago afternoon, the weight of the past 2 weeks settled heavily on her shoulders. The brisk November wind bit at her cheeks, but it did little to numb the ache inside her chest. Her lawyer, Tom Bennett, matched her stride. "We will fight this, Clara," he said, his voice firm but kind. Tom was in his mid-40s, with a quiet confidence that Clara found reassuring. He had agreed to take her case because, as he put it, "The facts are on your side, and your reputation deserves to be defended." "I know," Clara replied, clutching the strap of her bag. "But it's hard not to feel like I'm being crushed under the weight of something I cannot control." Tom stopped and turned to face her. "You are not alone in this," he said. "Remember that. We'll make sure the truth comes out." Clara nodded, appreciating his support, but unable to shake the gnawing doubt that crept into her mind at night. Back at the hospital, Clara felt the change in the air. She noticed the hushed conversations that stopped abruptly when she walked by. Some colleagues offered her sympathetic glances, while others avoided her altogether. She couldn't help but feel like a shadow of doubt had settled over her once bright career. Her close friend, Sophia Reyes, found her in the break room later that afternoon. Sophia, a pediatric nurse with a fierce protective streak, plopped down beside Clara with 2 cups of coffee. "Drink," Sophia ordered, sliding a cup toward her. Clara smiled faintly and took a sip. "Thanks." Sophia studied her for a moment. "You look like you're carrying the weight of the world on your shoulders." "I am," Clara said softly. "It feels like my entire life is under a microscope, and no matter how hard I try, I can't seem to convince people I did my job." "You don't have to convince everyone," Sophia said. "Just focus on the people who matter: the jury, your patients, and yourself." Clara sighed, grateful for Sophia's no-nonsense perspective. "And for the record, Sophia continued, her voice gentle. You've saved countless lives here. That won't change, no matter what anyone says. That evening, Clara returned to her apartment. The place that once felt like a sanctuary now felt like a cage, a space too small to contain her racing thoughts. She sat at her kitchen table, surrounded by piles of documents and medical charts that Tom had given her to prepare for the case. She rubbed her temples, exhaustion pulling at her every fiber. For a moment, she considered calling her parents, who had retired to Atlanta years ago, but she hesitated. They had always been proud of her, and the thought of burdening them with her struggles felt unbearable. Instead, she opened her laptop and stared at the cursor blinking on an empty document. She began typing a personal statement about her dedication to medicine, a reflection of why she had chosen this path in the first place. The next day, Tom called her into his office to review their strategy. His desk was cluttered with folders and legal briefs, but his demeanor was calm and collected. "We have to focus on the facts," Tom said, flipping through a thick file. "Your medical records are meticulous, and you documented every discussion with the Graham family. That will be our cornerstone." Clara nodded. "But how do we fight their emotions? Laura is grieving. She believes I failed her husband." Tom leaned back in his chair. "Grief is complicated. It's not unusual for families to lash out in search of someone to blame. But I believe we can show the jury the truth that you did everything in your power to save Peter Graham." As they worked through the evidence, Clara began to feel a glimmer of hope. Her meticulous nature, which had often been criticized as overkill, now felt like a lifeline. A few days later, as Clara walked through the hospital lobby, she heard a soft voice call her name. Turning, she saw Grace, a young nurse she had mentored during her residency. "Dr. Morgan," Grace said, her expression earnest. "I just wanted to say thank you." "For what?" Clara asked, taken aback. "For everything," Grace said. "You probably don't remember, but a few years ago, you stayed late to help me through a tough case. You didn't have to, but you did. It meant the world to me." Clara felt a lump rise in her throat. She had almost forgotten that moment, but hearing Grace's gratitude reminded her of the impact she had made beyond the operating room. "You're welcome, Grace," she said, her voice steady despite the emotions swirling inside her. "I'm glad I could help." Grace hesitated for a moment, then added, "You're an inspiration to so many of us. Don't let anyone take that away from you." As Grace walked away, Clara stood in the lobby, her heart lighter than it had been in weeks. It was a small act of kindness, but it reminded her of why she had chosen this path to make a difference, one life at a time. That night, Clara wrote a letter to herself. It wasn't a legal document or a strategy memo. It was a reminder of who she was and why she had fought so hard to become a surgeon. "I chose this path to save lives, to heal, and to offer hope. No lawsuit can take that away from me." She tucked the letter into her journal, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. Clara knew the road ahead would be challenging, but for the first time in weeks, she felt ready to face it. Clara sat alone in the hospital cafeteria, a half-eaten sandwich in front of her. She had picked at it absent-mindedly, her appetite dulled by the strain of the lawsuit and the undercurrent of judgment she felt from her peers. The typically bustling room felt quieter today, or maybe Clara's mind was filtering out the chatter. She caught a glimpse of Dr. Andrew Mills, one of the senior surgeons, walking in. When their eyes met, he gave her a tight, almost sympathetic smile before quickly turning away. Clara sighed, knowing what that look meant. The lawsuit wasn't just a legal battle. It was a stain on her career, no matter the outcome. Her phone buzzed on the table. It was a text from Tom. "We need to discuss the upcoming deposition. Can you meet tomorrow at 3 p.m.? Clara typed a quick reply, confirming the appointment before leaning back in her chair. She could feel her defenses weakening under the relentless pressure. The whispers at the hospital, the weight of Peter Graham's death, and the palpable grief of his family haunted her at every turn. That evening, Clara drove to her apartment, the familiar streets of the South Side blurred by the drizzle on her windshield. Her neighborhood was modest but full of life. Children played on the stoops of brownstones, their laughter cutting through the grayness of the evening. She parked in her usual spot and climbed the stairs to her second-floor apartment, where the faint smell of her neighbor's cooking greeted her. Inside, her apartment was warm and orderly, the way she liked it. The walls were adorned with photographs of her family and a few framed prints of inspirational quotes. On the shelf above her desk sat her most cherished possession, a small brass stethoscope her mother had given her when she graduated medical school. As she prepared dinner, her thoughts drifted back to her childhood. Growing up in Atlanta, Clara had been surrounded by a family that believed in the power of education and perseverance. Her parents, both teachers, had instilled in her the values of hard work and integrity. "You are capable of anything, Clara," her mother would say, "as long as you stay true to yourself." Those words felt distant now, overshadowed by the uncertainty of her present situation. The next day, Clara arrived at Tom's office for their meeting. Tom had already set up a stack of documents on the table, each meticulously labeled. "We need to prepare you for the deposition," he said as Clara took a seat. "The opposing counsel will try to rattle you. They'll question your decisions, your qualifications, even your character. It's crucial that you remain calm and stick to the facts." Clara nodded. "I can handle that." Tom studied her for a moment. "I believe you can, but it's not just about answering questions. It's about showing them who you are, a dedicated, competent surgeon who did everything possible for her patient." They spent the next hour going over potential questions and strategies. Tom's thoroughness was reassuring, but Clara couldn't ignore the knot of anxiety tightening in her chest. The hospital felt even colder the next morning. Clara kept her head down as she walked through the halls, avoiding eye contact with colleagues who seemed to regard her with a mixture of pity and suspicion. During a break between surgeries, she found herself in the locker room, staring at her reflection in the mirror. Her face looked tired, the shadows under her eyes more pronounced. "What am I doing?" she whispered to herself. "How did it come to this?" Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of the door opening. Meredith, her trusted nurse, walked in. "Clara," Meredith said gently, "you've been through hell these past few weeks, but I need you to know something." Clara turned to face her. "What's that?" "You're one of the best doctors I've ever worked with," Meredith said, her voice firm. "This hospital, these patients, they're lucky to have you. Don't let anyone make you forget that." Clara felt a lump rise in her throat. Meredith's words were a balm to her weary soul, a reminder that not everyone doubted her. Later that day, Clara received a call from Laura Graham's lawyer, requesting a meeting to discuss the case. Tom agreed to accompany her, though he warned her to manage her expectations. When they arrived at the lawyer's office, Laura and her teenage son Ben were already seated. Laura's expression was hard, her grief evident in the lines etched across her face. Ben, however, avoided eye contact, his body language tense. "I wanted to give you a chance to speak directly with Mrs. Graham," the lawyer began. "Sometimes these conversations can provide clarity." Clara nodded, her heart pounding. "Mrs. Graham, I want you to know how deeply sorry I am for your loss. Peter was a wonderful man, and I did everything in my power to save him." Laura's eyes narrowed. "You say that, but my husband is still gone. How do you expect me to believe you did everything?" Clara's voice trembled as she responded. "Because I was there with him, fighting for his life until the very end. I understand your pain, and I wish the outcome had been different. But I can assure you, I followed every protocol, every step I could, to give him a chance." For a moment, the room was silent. Then Ben spoke, his voice quiet but firm. "I remember something you said to me, Dr. Morgan. When my dad first got sick, you told me to keep talking to him, even when he was tired, because it would help him feel stronger. I did that every day. Clara nodded, her eyes misting. That's because I believed in his strength, and in yours. Ben looked down, his expression conflicted. Laura shifted uncomfortably, her anger faltering under the weight of her son's words. As Clara and Tom left the meeting, Tom placed a hand on her shoulder. You handled that well, he said. Sometimes, all we can do is plant a seed. It's up to them to decide what grows from it. Clara exhaled deeply, the encounter leaving her drained but strangely hopeful. She couldn't undo Peter Graham's death, but she could continue to stand by the truth of her actions. That evening, back in her apartment, Clara opened her journal and wrote, "Strength is not the absence of struggle. It is the resolve to keep going despite it." The cracks in her armor were real, but they were also a testament to the battles she was fighting. For the first time in weeks, Clara allowed herself a small smile. Tomorrow was another day, and she would face it with all the strength she had. The next morning, Clara returned to the hospital with a renewed determination. She knew the road ahead would not be easy, but something about Ben Graham's words lingered in her mind. It wasn't forgiveness, at least not yet, but it was a small reminder of the connection between her and the family she was accused of failing. The hospital buzzed with its usual energy, but Clara felt the tension in the air whenever she passed by groups of colleagues. Even the most supportive ones, like Sophia and Dr. Harris, seemed to tread carefully around her, as though afraid to bring up the lawsuit. She couldn't blame them. Her schedule was packed that day, 2 surgeries and a follow-up consultation. Clara immersed herself in the rhythm of her work, finding solace in the precision and focus it required. In the operating room, the world outside ceased to exist. By evening, the weight of the day caught up with her. She was walking through the hospital parking garage when she noticed an elderly man struggling to open the trunk of his car. His cane clattered to the ground as he fumbled with his groceries. Without hesitation, Clara approached. "Let me help you," she said, bending to retrieve the cane. The man looked up, startled but grateful. "Thank you, young lady. These hands of mine aren't what they used to be." Clara placed the groceries in the trunk and handed him the cane. "There you go. All set." He smiled warmly. "You're very kind. I don't see that often these days." Clara returned the smile, something easing in her chest. "It's no trouble at all. Have a good evening." As she walked to her car, she realized how much that simple interaction had lifted her spirits. Helping someone without the weight of judgment or expectation reminded her of why she had chosen a career in medicine in the first place. The next morning, Clara found a small envelope on her desk. Inside was a handwritten note. "Dr. Morgan, your kindness yesterday didn't go unnoticed. I may not know your struggles, but your heart is clear. Thank you for being a light in someone's day. Grace." Clara felt her breath hitch as she read the note. She remembered helping Grace's family years ago, but to receive her gratitude now, during one of the darkest times in her career, felt almost like fate. She tucked the note into her journal, a growing collection of reminders of her worth, her resilience, and her purpose. Later that week, Clara met with Tom to go over the next phase of their strategy. The deposition was looming, and Clara felt the familiar knot of anxiety tightening in her stomach. "You've got this," Tom said, his tone calm but encouraging. "Focus on the facts and stay composed. You've documented everything thoroughly. That's your strength." "What if they twist my words?" Clara asked. "What if I can't convince them?" Tom leaned forward. "Clara, you're not on trial for being perfect. You're a human being who did everything possible for her patient. Show them that humanity." On the day of the deposition, Clara arrived at the lawyer's office dressed in a tailored navy suit. She exuded professionalism, but inside, her nerves were rattling. The opposing lawyer wasted no time trying to undermine her confidence, questioning her decisions during Peter Graham's surgery with a sharp, accusatory tone. "Dr. Morgan," the lawyer said, leaning forward, Would you say it was reckless to proceed with such a high-risk surgery, knowing the odds? Clara met his gaze, her voice steady. No, I would not. The surgery was the only chance Mr. Graham had. I outlined every risk to him and his family, and they made the decision to proceed. I honored that decision with the utmost care and professionalism. The lawyer pressed on, but Clara stayed composed, relying on the preparation she and Tom had done. She felt drained by the end, but she also felt a quiet sense of pride. She had faced the storm and held her ground. The deposition left Clara emotionally spent, but she still had patience to see. As she made her rounds, she passed a small waiting area where a young boy sat with his mother. The boy, no older than 6, was clutching a stuffed dinosaur and looking nervously at the nurse. Clara paused and crouched down to his level. "Hey there," she said gently. "What's your dinosaur's name?" The boy hesitated, then whispered, "Rex." "Rex is a great name," Clara said with a warm smile. "You know, I think Rex is really brave, and so are you." The boy's face lit up, and Clara felt a surge of joy that momentarily erased the weight of the lawsuit. As she walked away, the boy's mother caught her eye. "Thank you," she mouthed, her gratitude clear. That night, Clara sat on her couch, reflecting on the week. The kindness she had received from Grace's note to the smile of a nervous little boy had begun to chip away at the walls of doubt and fear she had built around herself. She opened her journal and wrote, "Kindness is not weakness. It is strength that reminds us of our humanity, even in the darkest times." Clara knew she still had a long road ahead, but for the first time, she felt like she wasn't walking it alone. The unexpected kindness of others had planted a seed of hope, one she was determined to nurture. Clara entered Tom's office on a brisk Thursday morning, her coat still damp from the cold drizzle outside. The office, cluttered with case files and legal briefs, had become a second home of sorts over the past few weeks. Tom greeted her with a warm nod, holding a steaming cup of coffee in one hand and a thick folder in the other. "Morning," he said, gesturing for her to take a seat. "Morning," Clara replied, her voice steady despite the growing tension inside her. Tom placed the folder on the table and flipped it open. "We've gathered most of the evidence we need, but there's one piece I believe could be pivotal in the case: a recording of your pre-surgery consultation with the Graham family." Clara's brow furrowed. "The recording? I didn't think they'd still have it." Tom nodded. "Peter's son, Ben, recorded it on his phone. It wasn't part of their initial evidence submission, but the Graham lawyer mentioned it in passing during a meeting. I requested access, and they surprisingly agreed to share it." Clara's heart raced as she considered the implications. The consultation had been thorough, but she knew grief could distort memories. Later that afternoon, Tom played the recording in his office. Clara listened intently as her own voice filled the room, calm and measured. "We need to be completely transparent about the risks," the recording played. "This is a high-risk procedure. There is a chance we may not succeed, but without surgery, Mr. Graham's condition will worsen rapidly." She heard herself answering questions patiently, ensuring that Peter and his family understood the gravity of the situation. When the recording ended, Tom turned to her. "This could be the turning point, Clara. It's clear you were honest and thorough. You gave them every opportunity to make an informed decision." Clara nodded, relief washing over her. For the first time, she felt like the tide might be turning in her favor. That evening, Clara returned to her apartment, her thoughts swirling with hope and trepidation. She poured herself a cup of tea and sat by the window, watching the rain streak down the glass. As the hours passed, she found herself reflecting on her journey. The lawsuit had forced her to examine not only her actions, but also her motivations. Medicine had always been more than a career to her. It was a calling, a way to bring light into the darkest moments of people's lives. She thought of Peter Graham, a man who had placed his trust in her hands. Despite the tragedy, she felt a deep sense of gratitude for the opportunity to fight for him. The next day at the hospital, Clara noticed subtle changes in the way her colleagues treated her. Word of the deposition had spread, and while some people still avoided her, others offered small gestures of support, a nod in the hallway, a reassuring smile. During her lunch break, she bumped into Dr. Julian Harris, her mentor, and one of the hospital's most respected surgeons. "Clara," he said, his tone warm, "I've been following your case closely. I want you to know I'm proud of the way you're handling this." "Thank you, Dr. Harris," Clara replied, her voice tinged with emotion. He placed a hand on her shoulder. "The truth has a way of coming to light, even in the darkest of times. Keep your head up." That evening, Clara received an unexpected call from Ben Graham. She hesitated for a moment before answering, unsure of what to expect. "Dr. Morgan," Ben said, his voice hesitant, I just wanted to say I've been thinking a lot about everything that's happened. I listened to the recording of our consultation, and I realize now that you were just trying to help my dad." Clara felt her breath catch. "Thank you, Ben. That means a lot to me." There was a pause before he added, "I still miss him every day, but I know now it wasn't your fault. I hope my mom can see that too, someday." Clara's chest tightened, a mix of sorrow and relief flooding her senses. "I'm sorry for your loss, Ben. I truly am." As the days passed, Clara felt a growing sense of clarity. The shadows of doubt that had loomed over her were beginning to dissipate, replaced by a quiet confidence in her truth. She threw herself into her work with renewed vigor, determined to honor the trust her patients placed in her. The memories of Peter Graham's case still lingered, but they no longer felt like an anchor dragging her down. Instead, they became a source of strength, a reminder of her resilience and her commitment to the people she served. One evening, as Clara walked to her car after a long shift, she found a small envelope tucked under her windshield wiper. Inside was a handwritten note. "Dr. Morgan, thank you for always treating your patients with care and compassion. The hospital is lucky to have you." There was no signature, just a simple message that warmed her heart. She smiled, tucking the note into her pocket as she drove home. Clara opened her journal that night and wrote, "Hope is not the absence of hardship. It is the light we carry through the storm." She closed the journal and placed it on her bedside table, feeling a sense of peace she hadn't felt in weeks. The journey was far from over, but she knew she was not walking it alone. The courthouse loomed large as Clara approached, its stone facade cold and unyielding. Inside, the sterile air was heavy with anticipation. This was the first full day of the trial, and Clara could feel her pulse quicken as she took her seat next to Tom. "Remember," Tom said, his voice low and steady, "stick to the facts. You know the truth better than anyone." Clara nodded, clutching her notepad. She had reviewed every detail of the case a dozen times, yet the gravity of the moment was suffocating. The courtroom buzzed with quiet murmurs as the judge entered. Across the room, Clara caught a glimpse of Laura Graham, her face a mask of grief and anger. Ben sat beside her, his eyes downcast. The opposing counsel began their opening arguments, painting a picture of a grieving family betrayed by the very doctor they trusted. Clara's chest tightened as they described her actions in ways that felt twisted and unrecognizable. When Tom stood for their defense, his tone was calm but firm. "Dr. Morgan is a dedicated surgeon with an impeccable record," he began. "She has spent her entire career saving lives, and this case is no exception. Today, we will show that she acted with the utmost professionalism and care, giving Mr. Graham his best chance at survival despite the risks." His words were a lifeline, grounding Clara as the trial proceeded. The prosecution called their first witness, Laura Graham. Her testimony was raw and emotional, detailing her husband's decline and the family's decision to trust Clara with his care. "She told us there were risks," Laura said, her voice trembling. But I didn't think it would mean losing him. Tom's cross-examination was careful and respectful. He focused on the consultation, bringing up the recording. "Mrs. Graham," he said gently, "you've heard the recording of Dr. Morgan's discussion with your family. Is it fair to say she was clear about the risks involved?" Laura hesitated, her grief battling with the truth. "Yes," she admitted reluctantly. Tom nodded, his expression understanding. "And despite those risks, your family decided to proceed with the surgery, hoping for the best outcome?" "Yes," Laura said, her voice barely audible. The next day, it was Clara's turn to testify. The courtroom seemed to shrink as she took the stand, every pair of eyes fixed on her. The opposing counsel wasted no time trying to undermine her. "Dr. Morgan," they began, "is it true that you have faced complications in surgeries before?" "Every surgeon does," Clara replied evenly. "Medicine is unpredictable, and complications are a part of the reality we face." "And yet you proceeded with a high-risk surgery despite knowing the odds?" "Yes," Clara said firmly, "because it was Mr. Graham's only chance. I explained the risks to him and his family, and they made the informed decision to move forward." The lawyer's tone sharpened. "Do you believe you did everything possible to save him?" "I do," Clara said, meeting their gaze without flinching. "I exhausted every option available to me." Tom's turn to question Clara was a stark contrast. His voice was steady, guiding her through her testimony with precision. "Dr. Morgan," he said, "why did you agree to perform this surgery?" "Because Mr. Graham deserved the chance to fight for his life," Clara replied. "As a surgeon, it is my duty to give my patients that chance, even when the odds are against them." "And were you honest with the Graham family about those odds?" "Yes," she said. "I made sure they understood the risks and the potential outcomes before proceeding." Tom turned to the jury. "Dr. Morgan, would you have done anything differently?" Clara paused, the weight of her words pressing down on her. "No, I did everything I could to save him. I wish with all my heart that the outcome had been different, but I know I acted with integrity and compassion." As the trial continued, witnesses testified on Clara's behalf. Dr. Julian Harris spoke about her professionalism and skill, while Meredith described her unwavering dedication to her patients. The recording of the consultation was played for the jury, the clarity of Clara's warnings cutting through the prosecution's narrative. By the end of the week, Clara felt both exhausted and cautiously hopeful. The testimony had been grueling, but she had stayed true to herself. On the final day of the trial, the jury deliberated. Clara sat in the courtroom, her hands clasped tightly together. Tom leaned over. "No matter the verdict, you've shown incredible strength. That's something no one can take away from you." Clara nodded, her eyes fixed on the jury box as the foreperson stood to deliver the verdict. The jury found in favor of Clara, ruling that she had acted within the standard of care and was not negligent. Relief washed over her, but it was tempered by the sight of Laura Graham, her face crumpling in a mixture of grief and resignation. Clara wanted to reach out to her, to say something, but the words felt inadequate. Outside the courthouse, Clara stood in the crisp winter air, letting the moment sink in. Tom joined her, a rare smile on his face. "You did it," he said simply. "No," Clara replied, "we did it." As they parted ways, Clara felt a mix of emotions: relief, exhaustion, and a lingering sadness for the Graham family. That night, she wrote in her journal, "Justice does not erase pain, but it can bring clarity. I will carry this experience forward, not as a burden, but as a reminder of the strength found in truth." The hospital halls were quieter than usual as Clara made her rounds the morning after the verdict. The weight of the trial lingered in her chest like an aftershock, though relief had begun to seep into her steps. She had won, but it didn't feel like a victory. She paused outside room 216, one of her long-term patients, and checked the chart. As she walked in, The patient's daughter, an older woman with graying hair, looked up. "Dr. Morgan," she said with a warm smile, "we were just talking about you. Mom's feeling much better." Clara returned the smile and conducted the exam, letting the familiar routine soothe her frayed nerves. The patient, a woman in her late 70s, squeezed Clara's hand as she finished. "You've done so much for me, doctor," she said softly. "Don't ever let anyone make you doubt yourself." Clara blinked back a sudden sting of tears, the unexpected kindness catching her off guard. "Thank you," she said, her voice steady. "I'm glad to see you're improving." After her shift, Clara returned to her office to catch up on paperwork. Her desk was cluttered with patient files, notes from Tom about post-trial procedures, and letters of support that had arrived in the days leading up to the verdict. She sifted through them slowly, letting their words bolster her spirit. She was deep in thought when a knock on the door startled her. She looked up to see Laura Graham standing there, her expression hesitant. "Mrs. Graham," Clara said, rising to her feet. "Please, come in." Laura hesitated before stepping inside, her movements slow, as though weighed down by the gravity of her presence. "I won't take much of your time," Laura began, her voice quiet but steady. I felt I needed to come here, to see you, to say some things I've been holding on to." Clara nodded, gesturing for Laura to sit. She perched on the edge of her desk, her hands clasped in her lap. For a moment, silence hung between them, heavy with unspoken words. Then Laura spoke. "When we filed the lawsuit," she said, her gaze fixed on her hands, "I was angry. Angry at the world, angry at Peter for leaving me, and angry at you because you were the easiest person to blame. I needed someone to be responsible for what happened." Clara listened intently, her heart aching for the woman's pain. "I've had time to think about everything," Laura continued, her voice trembling. "And after hearing the recording, hearing you explain the risks, I realized something. I was wrong. You didn't fail, Peter. You did everything you could, and I see that now." Clara swallowed hard, her own voice trembling as she responded. "Mrs. Graham, I never stopped thinking about Peter. I carry every patient with me, especially the ones I can't save. I know I can't undo your loss, but I'm deeply sorry for the pain this has caused you." Laura nodded, tears brimming in her eyes. "I know. I believe you. And I'm sorry for the lawsuit, for the things I said. You didn't deserve that." The room felt charged with emotion as the two women sat together, their shared grief bridging the divide between them. As Laura rose to leave, she paused at the door. "My son Ben, he wanted me to tell you thank you for everything you tried to do for his dad." Clara's chest tightened, and she nodded. "Tell him I said thank you. That means a lot to me." After Laura left, Clara sat alone in her office, the conversation replaying in her mind. It wasn't forgiveness, it was something more complex. A fragile truce born from shared humanity and the courage to face painful truths. That evening, Clara walked through the quiet streets of her neighborhood, the crisp winter air filling her lungs. She thought about Laura's words, about the slow dismantling of the wall that had stood between them. Her footsteps carried her to a small community park where she often came to think. She sat on a bench, watching the lights of the city twinkle in the distance. A young woman jogged past, then paused and turned back. "Dr. Morgan?" Clara looked up surprised. "Yes? I don't know if you remember me," the woman said, her breath misting in the cold air. "I'm Kara Jensen. You operated on my dad last year, saved his life." Recognition dawned on Clara. "Of course. How's he doing?" "He's great," Kara said, her face lighting up. "And I've been meaning to tell you, thank you for everything. I don't think I ever said it properly." Clara felt a smile spread across her face. "Thank you, Kara. That means more than you know." As the woman jogged away, Clara leaned back on the bench, her thoughts turning to the many lives she had touched and the ones who had touched hers in return. That night, Clara opened her journal and wrote, "Healing is not just for the body. It is for the heart, the mind, and the connections we forge with others." Today, I was reminded that even in the hardest moments, kindness and understanding can break through the walls we build around ourselves. She closed the journal and placed it on her bedside table, feeling a sense of peace. The path ahead was still uncertain, but she no longer walked it burdened by fear or doubt. She walked it with hope. The hospital felt different in the days following Clara's meeting with Laura Graham. The tension that had lingered like a storm cloud over her head began to dissipate. Colleagues who once avoided her now greeted her with cautious warmth. The outcome of the trial, coupled with Laura's quiet acknowledgement of her mistake, seemed to signal a shift, not just in her professional life, but in the way Clara carried herself. Still, the memories of Peter Graham's case lingered. Clara found herself revisiting the small handwritten note Ben had sent her after the trial. "Thank you for trying," it read. It was simple, but carried a depth of understanding that Clara cherished. One late afternoon, Clara found herself in the hospital's conference room, poring over patient records with Meredith. As they discussed an upcoming surgery, Dr. Julian Harris stepped in. "Clara," he said, his tone thoughtful. "Do you have a minute?" Clara glanced at Meredith, who nodded in understanding, and left the room. "What's on your mind, Dr. Harris?" Clara asked, curious. He gestured for her to sit. "I've been watching how you've handled yourself these past months. The lawsuit, the trial, even your interactions with the Grahams. It's been nothing short of remarkable." Clara felt a blush creep into her cheeks. "I just tried to stay focused on the truth." Dr. Harris smiled. "And you did. But you also showed something this hospital and this profession needs more of: compassion. It's easy to forget the humanity behind our work, but you've never lost sight of it." Clara blinked, taken aback. "Thank you. That means a lot coming from you." "I've been meaning to talk to you about something," Dr. Harris continued. "There's an opening on the hospital's ethics committee. It's a demanding role, but I think you'd be perfect for it." Clara's eyes widened. "The ethics committee?" "Yes," he said. "Your experience, both in and out of the operating room, has given you a unique perspective. Think about it, Clara. The committee could benefit from someone like you." The idea of joining the ethics committee stayed with Clara as she returned to her apartment that evening. She sat at her kitchen table, the soft hum of the city outside her window, and stared at the brass stethoscope her mother had given her years ago. Clara thought about the decisions she had made, not just in Peter Graham's case, but throughout her career. She remembered the late nights, the agonizing choices, and the moments of doubt that had tested her resolve. Being on the ethics committee would be another challenge, one that required her to weigh the complexities of medicine against the human stories behind each case. But it was also an opportunity to grow, to use her experiences to guide others. The next morning, Clara met with Dr. Harris to accept the role. "I'll do it," she said, her voice steady. Dr. Harris nodded approvingly. "Good. I think you'll bring a lot to the table." Clara threw herself into the work, attending her first committee meeting later that week. The discussions were intense, but Clara found them invigorating. For the first time since the trial, she felt a sense of purpose beyond the operating room. One day, Clara was walking through the hospital lobby when she noticed Laura Graham sitting on one of the benches, her hands folded in her lap. Clara hesitated, unsure whether to approach, but Laura looked up and waved her over. "Mrs. Graham," Clara said as she approached, "it's good to see you." Laura offered a small smile. "I wanted to thank you again for everything, and to let you know that Ben's been talking about applying to medical school. He says he wants to help people the way you tried to help his dad." Clara's heart swelled. "That's wonderful to hear. He'll make a great doctor." Laura nodded, her expression softening. "It doesn't erase the pain, but it helps to know Peter's memory is inspiring something good. For the first time, Clara saw a glimmer of peace in Laura's eyes, and it filled her with a quiet sense of hope. As the days turned into weeks, Clara found herself growing more confident in her new role. The Ethics Committee became a place where she could channel her experiences into meaningful discussions, helping shape policies that prioritized both medical excellence and patient care. She also began mentoring younger doctors and nurses, sharing her story not as a cautionary tale, but as a testament to resilience and compassion. One evening, as Clara was leaving the hospital, Grace stopped her in the hallway. "Dr. Morgan," Grace said, her face glowing, "I've been accepted into the surgical residency program here. I couldn't have done it without you." Clara felt a lump rise in her throat. "Grace, that's amazing. Congratulations." Grace hesitated, then added, "You believed in me when I didn't believe in myself. I just wanted you to know how much that's meant to me." Clara placed a hand on Grace's shoulder. "You've earned this, Grace. I'm proud of you." As Grace walked away, Clara felt a surge of gratitude. The seeds of kindness she had sown were bearing fruit in ways she hadn't anticipated. That night, Clara opened her journal and wrote, "Growth is not a destination, but a journey. Every challenge, every connection shapes who we are and who we can become. Today, I see the beauty in that journey." She closed the journal with a deep sense of fulfillment. The shadows of the trial had faded, replaced by the steady light of purpose and hope. Clara woke to the soft glow of morning light streaming through her bedroom window. For the first time in months, she felt a sense of ease. Her days had begun to regain their rhythm, a balance between surgeries, her new role on the Ethics Committee, and the mentorship program she had recently started for aspiring medical professionals. As she sipped her coffee that morning, Clara opened her journal to review her latest entry. "Growth is a journey," she had written, and the words resonated more deeply now than when she first put them on paper. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. She wasn't expecting anyone. As she opened it, she was surprised to find Laura and Ben Graham standing there. "Mrs. Graham, Ben," Clara said, her voice laced with surprise. "Please come in." The Grahams stepped into Clara's modest apartment, their demeanor more relaxed than Clara had ever seen. Ben was carrying a small box, which he placed gently on her coffee table as they sat. "Thank you for seeing us," Laura began, her voice warm but slightly hesitant. "Of course," Clara replied, sitting across from them. "What brings you here?" Laura exchanged a glance with Ben, who nodded encouragingly. She then turned to Clara, her expression soft but serious. "I wanted to thank you, Dr. Morgan," Laura said, "for not only the care you gave Peter, but also for the way you've carried yourself through everything that happened." Clara blinked, caught off guard by the sincerity in Laura's tone. "I'm not sure what to say, but thank you." Laura continued, her voice steady but emotional. "I've spent months blaming you for something I now understand was beyond your control. It took me a long time to accept that, but I needed to tell you in person I was wrong." Ben chimed in, his voice filled with quiet determination. "Dr. Morgan, I've been learning more about what it means to be a doctor, and the more I understand, the more I realize how much you did for my dad. I'm applying to med school because of you, and I hope I can be even half the doctor you are." Clara felt a lump rise in her throat. She had fought so hard to maintain her composure during the trial, but this was different. This was healing, unfiltered and genuine. "Thank you," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Your words mean more to me than I can express. And Ben, I have no doubt you'll be an incredible doctor. You have your father's strength." Ben smiled, his face lighting up with hope. Laura gestured toward the box Ben had brought. "We wanted to give you something," she said. Clara hesitated, then opened the box. Inside was a photograph of Peter Graham, smiling warmly, and a small card that read, in gratitude for your compassion and dedication." Tears welled in Clara's eyes as she looked at the photograph. She traced its edges with her fingers, feeling the weight of the moment. "Thank you," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "I'll treasure this." The Grahams stayed for another half hour, sharing stories about Peter and their journey through grief. By the time they left, Clara felt a sense of closure she hadn't realized she needed. As she stood by the door, watching them walk down the hallway, she whispered, "Thank you, Peter," her voice filled with quiet reverence. Later that day, Clara attended an ethics committee meeting. The discussions were as intense as ever, but Clara found herself approaching them with newfound clarity. The trial, the Grahams' forgiveness, and her own reflections had reshaped her perspective on the delicate balance between medicine and humanity. During a break, Dr. Harris pulled her aside. "You seem different today," he said. "Lighter, somehow," Clara smiled. "I had a visit from the Grahams this morning. It was unexpected but healing." Dr. Harris nodded knowingly. Sometimes the hardest conversations are the ones that bring the most peace. That evening, Clara met with Grace and 2 other residents she was mentoring. They sat in a small hospital conference room, discussing the challenges of balancing technical excellence with empathy in medicine. "Being a doctor isn't just about what happens in the operating room," Clara told them. "It's about the connections we build with our patients and their families, even in the most difficult moments. Those connections are what make this work meaningful." Grace nodded, her eyes bright with determination. "You've shown us that, Dr. Morgan. Thank you for leading by example." Clara felt a swell of pride as she looked at the young doctors in front of her. They represented the future, and she was honored to play a role in shaping it. That night, Clara sat by her window, the city lights twinkling in the distance. She opened her journal and wrote, "Forgiveness is a bridge, not an end. It connects us to the past, helps us heal, and guides us toward the future." Clara closed the journal, a sense of peace washing over her. The journey that had begun with Peter Graham's surgery had taken her through pain, doubt, and self-discovery. Now, it had brought her to a place of growth, compassion, and hope. She smiled to herself, ready for whatever the next chapter of her life would bring. The soft hum of morning activity filled the hospital as Clara walked into the lobby, her steps purposeful but unhurried. She had a full day ahead, a surgery in the morning, a meeting with the ethics committee in the afternoon, and a mentorship session in the evening. It was busy, but for the first time in months, Clara felt in control, grounded by the sense of purpose that had slowly rebuilt itself through her challenges. Her first stop was the surgical suite, where a young patient named Mia was awaiting an operation to repair a congenital heart defect. Mia, only 6 years old, clutched a stuffed bunny as Clara entered the room to greet her and her parents. "Good morning, Mia," Clara said, crouching to meet the girl's eyes. "I see you brought a friend with you today." "This is Bun Bun," Mia said shyly, holding the stuffed animal closer. Clara smiled. "Bun Bun looks like a great helper. I think having him here will make you extra brave today." Mia's parents exchanged grateful glances, their anxiety easing under Clara's calm, warm demeanor. Clara explained the procedure again in simple terms, ensuring they felt reassured before she headed to the operating room. The surgery was challenging, but it went smoothly. As Clara removed her gloves and stepped out of the operating suite, she felt a familiar sense of satisfaction. Mia's heart was repaired, and her future now held possibilities that once seemed distant. Later that afternoon, Clara attended the ethics committee meeting. Today's agenda included a particularly complex case involving a patient who had refused a life-saving procedure. Clara listened intently as the other members discussed the ethical dilemmas, their perspectives rooted in policies and principles. When it was her turn to speak, Clara leaned forward, her tone measured but resolute. "We can't lose sight of the human element. The patient's decision is rooted in fear, not just medical reasoning. If we approach this with compassion and clear communication, we may find a way to help them reconsider. Dr. Harris nodded approvingly. Well said, Dr. Morgan. Let's explore that path further. Clara felt a quiet pride as the discussion shifted, her words influencing the direction of the committee's recommendations. She was finding her voice in this new role, blending her experiences with her unwavering belief in the importance of empathy in medicine. As the evening set in, Clara met with her mentees Grace and two other residents, Tariq and Evelyn. They gathered in the same small conference room where Clara had once struggled to prepare for her own residency exams. The topic for the session was resilience. Clara shared her journey, not shying away from the moments of doubt and fear she had faced. Medicine will test you, she told them, her voice steady but heartfelt. Not just your skills, but your spirit. There will be days when you question whether you're strong enough. But I promise you this, the connections you build, the lives you touch, will remind you why you chose this path. Tariq leaned forward, his expression thoughtful. How did you find the strength to keep going, even when things felt impossible? Clara smiled softly. I didn't do it alone. I leaned on my friends, my mentors, and even my patients. Strength isn't just something you find within yourself, it's something you build through the kindness and support of others. As the session ended, Grace lingered behind, a hesitant look on her face. Dr. Morgan, she began, I wanted to thank you again. Your story, it's inspired me in ways I didn't think possible, and I hope one day I can pay it forward, the way you have. Clara placed a hand on Grace's shoulder. You will, Grace. I have no doubt about that. That night, Clara returned to her apartment, the familiar warmth of her home wrapping around her like a comforting embrace. She lit a candle on the windowsill, its soft glow illuminating the journal that had become her trusted confidant. She opened it to a fresh page and wrote, Hope is a seed. It grows through every act of kindness, every moment of resilience, and every connection we nurture. Today, I see that growth in myself, and I am ready for whatever comes next. As she closed the journal, Clara felt a deep sense of peace. The journey she had walked from the trial to the Graham's forgiveness, from doubt to purpose, had transformed her in ways she hadn't expected. She knew challenges would come again, but now she faced the future not with fear, but with hope. The story concludes with Clara sitting by her window, the city lights twinkling like scattered stars. Her reflection in the glass showed a woman who had faced the storms of life and emerged stronger, wiser, and more compassionate. This was not the end of her journey, but a new beginning. As Clara gazed out her window, she reflected on the road she had traveled. Every challenge, every tear, every sleepless night had brought her closer to this moment, a place of growth, forgiveness, and renewed purpose. The forgiveness from Laura Graham, the gratitude from Ben, and the unexpected kindness of strangers had reminded her of the humanity that bound them all. Her life was far from perfect, but it was full of connections that mattered, lessons that shaped her, and a mission to inspire the next generation of healers. Clara's journey was proof that even in the darkest times, perseverance and compassion could light the way forward. As the night deepened and the city glimmered below, Clara smiled softly. Her story was just one of many, and she knew that every life she touched would carry forward a piece of her legacy. If Clara's story of resilience, compassion, and growth inspired you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more heartfelt stories like this one. Join us on a journey through stories that uplift, challenge, and remind us of the power of kindness and hope. Let us know your thoughts in the comments. Your engagement helps us continue bringing meaningful stories to life. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next story.